Name is Quinton Smith. I'm a junior at Ottawa Hills High School, and I'm going to be going over space-based efficiency and tandem perovskite solar cells. I'm going to walk through what that means in just a sec. But before I get to that, I really do want to talk a little bit about my background and kind of how I got into this research. And so, in general, it started off kind of this last summer where I was, looking for things to do, and my parents work at the University of Toledo. And so we ended up with this option that I was considering that was called the RISE program. And so it gave me an internship at UT, and I worked in the photovoltaics lab. And I actually had a poster published regarding some similar topics. And so I had a great experience there. And so I came back this year with some honors research class experience and some coordination there to work on a new project. And that is the space-based efficiency. And we'll get to that in just a sec. So let's start off talking about background and explorations. And so this is kind of the meat of what it is and where it comes from. But before I do, I just want to add one more note, which is that this is preliminary findings. And I do kind of mention that briefly in the discussion, and I'll get into some more figures closer up. I know there's some cramped stuff here in the results, but we'll get into that in a bit. This is preliminary findings. This is coordination with the lab, with a lot of people working years in this lab on various conditions, projects, devices, fabrication, etc. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking a small slice of what I've done with some coordination, but a lot of this is my own data and a lot of development together. Just for some brief preliminary findings regarding this. And so it is a future project. There's a lot more to do in the future, but at the same time, we also definitely see some really exciting and interesting things just from these preliminary findings. And so that's what I want to share today. And so going back into the background and experience, there is an image here. Let's see, I'm not going to be able to zoom in on it right now, but we'll get into some of the details there as we talk about it. And so when we're talking about solar technology, we're talking about solar cells, environmental factors, efficiency, energy, all these things. The most common thing that we think of is, okay, put them on your house or maybe just an electrical grid that you're connected to, and this is all terrestrial. This is on Earth where we have pretty standard electrical fields. We have an atmosphere. We have a variety of things that this project isn't even within the depth of this project, but are the most common kind of thoughts regarding solar tech. But when you really think about it, we have lots of systems of energy on Earth, right? We have natural gas, wind power, water power, hydroelectric, waves, geothermal, etc. Nuclear even, which could be spread to space. But when we're talking about satellites and telescopes and a lot of things, that the more and more that we reach for the stars, as people like to say, we really need to develop all these technology, like all these like instruments and the ways to power them. And really the best way to do that when you're in the middle of space and you don't really have waves or wind, no atmosphere necessarily, and that's why you're generally going to look to solar panels and things where it's just we have stars, we have the sun in our universe, in our solar system, that is. And so solar panels kind of become this fundamental system of energy for like the way that we do what we do and the way that we kind of take what we know and we spread it to the universe. All the buzzwords you want to touch on there really rely on solar energy. And so a lot of issues that go into that are going to be, obviously costs, but things where it's like, okay, how can you maximize efficiency? How can you maximize the way these are working and scaling? And a lot of different things in space. And so tandem perovskite solar cells are one of these fairly new. I mean, perovskite's been around for a bit, but fairly new and continuously achieving types of solar cells, which again, I will say what they mean in just a sec, that really kind of test these bounds and provide, as I say here, they provide some flexible, cheap, scalable, and high efficiency devices. And so obviously a lot of things that you want to see in space. And I get into that a bunch in my paper. But when we're talking about tandem perovskite, I'm going to keep saying that, and I do want to say what it means. All it means is a two-layered solar cell made of perovskite semiconductor. And so two-layer, it's called tandem bi-junction, multi-junction, two-layer, whatever you want to call it. It is, as you see in the structure here, essentially two layers of solar cells. So you have your wide and your narrow band gap, which kind of encompass two different spectrums of light that overlap a little bit, but that allows you for broader levels of light consumption on the spectra, absorption, I should say. And so a lot of like UV components, IR infrared components, things that are more present in space and less absorbed by like ozone in the atmosphere when you don't have an atmosphere, are stuff that these tandem cells can really try and broadly capture and make sure that you're getting the most absorption you can achieve. Then perovskite is a new semiconductor, new at least in terms of some of this advanced, especially space-based research. And what it is it's cheap and it's scalable. It's easy to manufacture. It's flexible. It's lighter, and so it's a lot of things that you really do want in space. Though there are challenges, and the main challenge there is the degradation of perovskites. And efficiency. There's a lot of factors that go into that. But in general, there's a few different things we're going to be considering on this project, and I should probably get into it instead of spending all the time on background. But really, what it is it's things like AM0, air mass zero, it just means no atmospheric effects with the light. Um, and things like thermal cycling. So when you're in space, temperature fluctuates very fast for operation, and so it's kind of how do you control these factors, look at degradation, look at efficiency, and looking at all these things together. And that's why things like JV and EQE, which I'll talk about in just a minute, are some good ways to measure efficiency, and we can kind of interpret a variety of these things, um, which we really will broadly discuss and then get some conclusions and some improvements for the future that I find really exciting. And so going into fabrication, as I was talking about, there is a lot of coordination in this lab. And so the postdocs in this lab generally spend about 3 hours fabricating in-lab devices. So I coordinate with them, I work with them in the process. But in general, these devices are made by the postdocs, and this is kind of the structure that they follow. So some of the key points here, of course, the perovskites. There's two different perovskites for the narrow and wide bandgap layer. And something that I actually studied a bit more over the summer, which is the HTL composition for the narrow bandgap. And so what that means is when you have a photon striking a solar cell, and again, narrow bandgap is just one of the two layers, the layer that has considerably lower energy absorption in terms of a narrow bandgap, and that's related to just physics as a whole. But the P.PSS and P3CT, these are two specific polymers that really compose this HTL layer. And so, as I was saying, when a photon strikes the solar cell, one of the active layers, which in this case are perovskite, you have electrons displaced in these positive holes, which are just like the remnant positive charges that actually can move. And so, in order to go to the terminal ends, like the electrodes of the cell, you need to have transport layer, transport materials. And so, ETL, electron transport layer, usually uses metals, not necessarily metals, but like different components than HTL. Sorry, here we have fullerene tin oxide. And then you have HTL, which is something where, in this case, we're using these specific polymers. And that's something where that's a big development. And that's a lot of thing that people are looking at and considering. And so there's a lot of factors there. But in general, we have these fabricated devices. We're storing them in this vacuum sealed chamber. Everything is constant, trying to prevent degradation. But we are using, in this experiment, some older and some damaged cells. And so that provides context for some of the successes and challenges that we see. And again, we're measuring EQE, JV, and thermal cycling. And when we get to the results now, I'm going to talk about what each of those mean. And I'm going to go over this real quick, and then I'm going to switch to the actual slides next. That way you can see these graphs bigger. As I said, it is a little bit crammed in here based on some of the functions of how we needed to lay things out here. But I do want to start with thermal cycling because that is one of the most interesting parts of this project in terms of we actually only have one thermal cycling machine in our lab that is capable of doing this function. And it was programmed by a grad student who monitors the software, a lot of coordination with him, and it takes a long time because each cycle is about 20 minutes long for our cells, and we did nearly 1,000, about 900 cycles here with just our preliminary finding samples. And so what it's doing is it's taking JV measurements, and I know I keep saying JV, I'll get to that, it's right here, but it's taking these measurements for efficiency. JV is just current density by voltage, but every 25 degrees Celsius increment. And so it goes from 25 to 60 to 10 to 25 degrees Celsius, and every time it reaches back here, it repeats and it gets that measurement taken. And so we essentially just normalize that here based on efficiency calculations, all that's discussed in the paper, but how it's related to each other. And then JV data, EQE data, essentially just two more measures of efficiency. This separates the layer. This just talks about two different atmospheric effects. And I'm going to run ahead and I'm going to show you these graphs, these plots that were made mostly on Python. This one was made separately, but the others were made using Matplotlib Python. And I'm just going to show you these real quick and talk about a few other things. So here we can see, I want to point out, about 90% efficiency here for over 200 cycles, and about over 80% efficiency the entire thermal cycling. It kind of plateaus there. So these devices are retaining over 80% operational efficiency as far as we can tell indefinitely, and we cannot extrapolate on that, of course, but we do see a narrow plateau. And so as we continue cycling and as we do longer cycles, we might see some differences here, but I think it does look really exciting. In the conclusions, I'll talk about what that means. EQE plots. EQE is essentially the ratio of your charge carriers, so your electrons in your holes, which I talked about, collected. So the things that you're actually obtaining in terms of using them, utilizing them, just to the photons that are striking the incident photons. It's just a ratio of efficiency, accounting for a few different factors. Again, all discussed in the paper. But I do want to finish this up real quick so I don't run over the time limit. And so I'm just going to talk real briefly about what this means. And this means JSC, it's short circuit current density. It's one of the factors in power conversion efficiency. And it's commonly used to kind of integrate these curves and get one number for them. It does correspond very closely to efficiency. So as you're looking at the wideband gap, you'll see bold layers. These, same for here, are going to be the thermally cycled cells. So one thing you notice, first of all, JSCs are lower for narrowband gap. Not great, but even more, the thermally cycled JSCs are actually lower for the narrowband gap as well. And so I do want to run through a couple more things here because I don't want to take over 20 minutes of your time. I want to stay in that limit. But in general, there's a few quick things we can look at. We'll talk about in the conclusion in just a sec. And then lastly, we have JV. All these are current density by voltage, which means you're measuring your current density, which is just your current accounting for the solar cell area, by your voltage, which kind of together, you might know Watt's law, make power. And so obviously there's some factors that can be calculated there, and that's used for our normalized efficiency in our thermal cycling. But here we just look at specific JV of our batches. And it's interesting to note that using VOC, which is another factor, it's open circuit voltage, it's similar to the JSC in terms of a factor in power conversion efficiency. In general, you see lower values for this thermally cycled batch. So that's kind of where you get to notice it, and that's a big important takeaway. And then one other interesting thing that's a little inconsistent with the data is that AM 1.5G. So this is your scattering absorption Earth light, right? The light that's being scattered, absorbed by Earth's atmosphere and surface, and that's the conditions there with actually lower power and light intensity, incident light. They actually are not performing necessarily significantly less. There's some of these flatter curves, and so that's something where you wouldn't really expect it, but it's interesting to consider. And so I do want to come back here and just talk briefly. I'm going to mention, here we are, I'm going to mention super quickly the graphics here. A lot of these are from me, photographs of the lab, plots. There is a few ResearchGate and papers graphics that are cited here and used, and I just want to reference them as well as my acknowledgments here for some coordination. But running out of time, let's just go quickly over discussion and references. I mentioned the references, but what does this mean for the future? And what this means is our cells had some really exciting developments and some really strong thermal cycling data and some things that I know it's almost seems subjective when you're hearing about it from me, but if you look at some of these papers, what these things are talking about, you'll see for the context of these two-layer cells, there's some incredible factors going into this thermal cycling efficiency, and there's lots of room for improvement. Again, these are older damaged cells with this specific composition, and there's a lot of things that kind of go into that. And in general, EQE, one of the biggest takeaways for our future development of this project is the fact that we see better performance in wide versus narrow bandgap EQE. And so what that means is that when we're making our narrow bandgap and we're focusing on these HTL layers specifically, we need to make changes because the thermal cycling is degrading is the correct word, that layer much more in the efficiency data. And we're just using two different light wavelengths, component wavelengths, to kind of isolate that for the EQE, which I talk about briefly here. But in general, we have some strong performances and we have a few things to consider for the future. And so as we do this, it's a fairly new cutting edge field, the specific kind of consideration and some of the comparisons made here. And so I'd love to continue this and I'd love to talk about how it works in the future. So that will be all. Thank you for listening.